Hey guys, tonight we slip back in time to ancient Rome. A city of marble columns, gossiping aqueducts, and senators strutting like peacocks through the forum in sandals that might just be staring back at you. You wander along a street polished smooth by centuries of footsteps, where the air smells faintly of roasted garum and crushed basil. Lanterns flicker above carved doorways. And then you spot them, crimson-strapped shoes with little faces on them, peeking out from beneath a senator's white toga. Not painted faces. Not smiley faces. Real, sculpted, brooding leather faces on shoes. You blink, rub your eyes, and nope, they're still there. Stone-cold expressions pressed into the softest imported leather, gazing at you from ankle height like they know your secrets. Your modern brain immediately screams, absolutely not. But in Rome, these were status symbols. And not having them could get you tossed from power, or worse, laughed at. And you probably won't survive that, not in this Senate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking toward the Curia Julia, Rome's Grand Senate House. It looms before you, stoic and cold, guarded not by soldiers but by a battalion of dignified men in ivory-white togas with wine-red stripes. They nod subtly as you pass, not to greet you but to remind you, you're being watched, and not just by eyes above their belts. Look down. The shoes. Their faces. Silent but smug. Here's the thing. Back then, footwear wasn't just about covering your feet or avoiding goat dung in the alley. It was messaging. A silent brag. A wearable resume. And if you were a Roman senator, those shoes had to be red. Dyed with expensive pigments like cinnabar, which was poisonous, but hey, fashion over safety, right? They called them calcii senatorii. And they weren't the open sandals you're picturing. These were closed-toed, ankle-high leather shoes, crisscrossed with straps and dyed a deep reddish brown. And sometimes they came with something a little extra, a metal ornament or embossed leather face, right on the tongue or toe of the shoe. Scholars argue if these faces were meant to resemble gods, mythic figures, or even the senator himself. One fringe theory? They were meant to intimidate, make the floor feel judged. You walk past a shoemaker's stall, let's call him Lucius, and you watch him stitch a tiny, grimacing face onto the upper of a crimson shoe. He wipes his brow and says, "They want them frowning this year." Stern. Grave. None of that smiling Jupiter nonsense. Apparently, even foot expressions followed trends. Historians still argue whether every senator had a face on their shoe or just the most dramatic ones. Some say it began with generals returning from campaigns, wanting to display the faces of conquered enemies. Others think it's just one of those things like powdered wigs or shoulder pads that got weirdly popular and stuck. But these weren't just fashion statements. You couldn't just wear any shoes. Roman society had strict laws called sumptuary laws, telling you what you could and couldn't wear based on your class. Togas, rings, tunics, and yes, even shoes. If your shoes were too red and you were a nobody, you'd be fined or shamed. And if you were a senator and tried to show up barefoot, might as well wear a tunic made of old fishnet. You'd be laughed out of the forum. You make your way inside the Senate, where marble echoes and whispers chase each other like gossip. The floors cool under your feet, but not for the men with their finely crafted calcii. Their shoes thud authoritatively as they walk, a noise designed to say, "I make decisions that affect provinces." The faces? They peek from beneath their robes when they sit, like silent advisors glaring up at them from their own feet. One senator, old, stoic, smells faintly of myrrh and politics, leans over and says, "Young man, your shoes are quiet. That means your voice will be too." You look down. Plain sandals. Oops. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The faces? They weren't just decoration. They had a function. Some had hollow eyes filled with colored wax. Others were molded from bronze or silver. One theory, the faces represented household spirits or laras, meant to protect the senator. Another, they were meant to remind him of his duty. You're less likely to vote selfishly when two tiny versions of your ancestors are glaring up at you all day. You overhear a debate nearby. Two senators arguing whether the face on Gaius's shoes looks too much like Caesar. He's either being sycophantic or subversive, one says. It's hard to tell in Rome. One senator stretches out his leg like he's casually showing off. You can't help but notice the exaggerated cheekbones and sneering lips on his shoe's face. It's giving judging your poor taste in wine. This was a whole genre of passive aggression. Imagine walking into a political meeting today with shoes that look like your rival. Subtle? No. Roman? Absolutely. You step back out into the street and hear whispers. Did you see Marcus's shoes? Hideous. Looked like a goat with indigestion. Turns out, even bad shoe faces were memorable. As night falls, the faces seem to shift in the firelight. You wonder, did these men ever feel haunted by their own shoes? Walking monuments to ambition, vanity, legacy. And maybe guilt? Remember, in Rome, your reputation started at the ground level. Before you opened your mouth, people saw your footwear. If it gleamed, you had wealth. If it frowned, you had gravitas. If it smirked, you were probably up to something. And so, you find a quiet step to sit on. You look at your own feet. No faces. No leather. Just you listening to the city breathe. And somewhere in the distance, a senator's shoes walk away, staring at the cobblestones like they're remembering everything. Awaiting continue. You wake with a start, still seated on the marble step outside the Senate. Rome is quieted, though not entirely. The night is never truly silent here. You hear the faint clink of a wine jug, the shuffle of sandals, and the distant laughter of someone far too drunk to remember the difference between a plebeian and a patrician. The moonlight makes every statue look smug. You're not dreaming. That senator's shoe really did have a face. You need answers. But Rome, being Rome, won't hand them to you in a scroll. You have to dig, metaphorically, but also maybe literally. So you head toward the Subura district, where the elite rarely tread. It's where Rome's grime meets its gossip. If the Forum is the brain of the empire, the Subura is the beating, unfiltered heart. And that's where you meet her, Nona. Shoemaker to senators, gladiators, and the occasional aspiring poet who pays in verse. She's sitting cross-legged under a striped awning, a bronze awl in one hand, a half-finished pair of red calcii in the other. You greet her, careful not to step on the leather scraps curling across the dusty floor like dead leaves. She eyes your plain sandals and says, "You walk light. You think light. That's a problem." You ask her, "Why the faces?" She smirks. "Because when your feet are rich, your thoughts must look serious. These men were power on their soles. I just give it a nose and a frown." Nona explains that these faces are more than decoration. They're masks. Not to hide behind, but to project. Senators used to wear actual death masks of their ancestors during funerals. Wax replicas that reminded everyone just how noble their bloodline was. Over time, those same features trickled down to their clothes and shoes. You picture it, a long-dead Roman patriarch immortalized in wax, glaring forever from a sandal. Talk about soul custody. Now, historians still argue whether the shoe faces were meant to mimic these ancestral masks, or were something else entirely. Some suggest they were modeled after Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and endings. That would explain the stern expressions. Janus watched both forward and backward, just like a senator was supposed to do. Another theory? The faces were simply artistic flourishes by ambitious cobblers trying to impress high-paying clients. Like if your barber also carved your likeness into your hat. But Nona offers a quirkier idea. "I once made a pair with Dionysus on the left and Saturn on the right. Balance, you see. Wine and law. Madness and order. That senator? Dead within a week." She shrugs. "Maybe he wore them backward." You laugh. Nona doesn't. She tells you how she chooses the leather, imported from Hispania for its pliability. The dye comes from crushed minerals, including cinnabar and madder root. The metalwork for the facial features? Often made of electrum, a mix of gold and silver, delicately pounded into cheekbones, brows, and scowls. Each pair took a week to make. Longer if the client had jowls, she mutters. And it wasn't just men's shoes getting attention. She gestures toward a shelf. Women's calcii with floral etchings and crescent moons, less intimidating than the male versions, but no less detailed. One in the corner even has a tiny embossed cat face. "Senator's wife," Nona says, sighing. "Wanted it to wink. I told her no." You ask if these shoes made people walk differently. She grins. "Oh yes. You wear a face on your foot. You think twice about tripping over a chicken. Imagine your reputation getting soiled in the gutter with pigeon droppings." The more you listen, the clearer it becomes. These shoes were theater. Every Roman life was a kind of performance, and senators were the stars, standing atop their leather stages, their feet delivering silent monologues of piety, power, and polished politics. But there's more. Nona pulls out a worn scroll, one of her sketches. It's not just shoes, it's battle scenes etched into soles. One client wanted the Battle of Actium under his heel, so that every step crushed Mark Antony's fleet. Another requested Medusa's face on the tongue. To freeze his rivals with envy, he said. Historians still debate whether such designs were ever worn in the Senate itself. Wouldn't that be too much? Too dramatic, even for Rome? But then again, this was the city that built a palace just to house a giant rotating dining room. Subtlety wasn't exactly the vibe. Suddenly, a customer approaches. Young, clearly rich, the kind of patrician whose teeth have never met an olive pit. He asks Nona to design a pair with Apollo's face for confidence. She snorts. Apollo never wore shoes. He leaves, offended. You ask if Nona misses the days when shoes were simpler. She leans back. Simple shoes make simple men. Give me faces. Give me myth. Let their feet carry the weight of their stories. You thank her, but before you leave, she tosses you a scrap of dyed leather. Pressed into it is a small, crude face, eyebrows arched, lips pursed as if whispering secrets from the soul. You run your thumb over it. Smooth. Almost warm. You slip it into your pouch. As you make your way back toward the forum, you begin to notice every senator's stride. Confident, deliberate, and just a little stiff, like they know they're being watched, even from below. The shoes aren't just footwear. They're witnesses. Every lie, every vote, every betrayal, they see it all. And they remember. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the faces are there to remind senators that no step is truly private. Every decision leaves a mark, even if it's just a dusty imprint of a god's grimace on the Senate floor. And as the first rays of dawn creep over the rooftops, lighting up the cobblestones and catching the glint of polished leather, you find yourself wondering, if you had to wear a face on your shoe, whose would it be? You follow the sun up the Palatine Hill, its golden fingers brushing against the marbled temples and sleeping porticos. Your legs ache from last night's wandering, but your mind is sharper than ever. The weight of that tiny leather face in your pouch presses against your hip like a reminder. There's more to this story, and it's not just about fashion. It's about power, and control, and possibly a little bit of spite. Because now you're ready to understand who could wear these shoes with faces, and more importantly, who couldn't. You reach the house of the Vestal Virgins, still in shadow, its garden eerily silent except for the soft flutter of doves. You lean against a statue of Vesta and think about how utterly stratified Roman society was. There were ranks, then ranks within ranks, and under all of it dirt, and those who weren't even allowed to have a rank. You want to know what it took to earn a pair of fancy face-footed calcii. And the answer? A lot of groveling, a good bloodline, or a military triumph. Bonus points for a chin cleft and a public enemy. Roman clothing wasn't just about taste. It was about rules. Everyone's garments were encoded with their social status, like human QR codes. And shoes, even more so. A patrician's shoe wasn't just leather. It was a proclamation. A velvet rope around their toes. You remember what Nona told you. Only senators could wear those specific face-emblazoned calcii. But not just any senators, those currently serving. A former senator caught wearing them could be fined, or worse, mocked on the street. And in Rome, public shame was a fate nearly as bad as exile. Imagine walking around with a senator's shoes and no Senate seat to match. You'd be a walking punchline, like a guy wearing military medals he didn't earn, except those medals are staring back at people. Historians still argue whether these shoe rules were enforced strictly, or just ritualized snobbery that everyone played along with. There are tales of upwardly mobile equestrians sneaking extra embroidery onto their boots, only to be called out by some bored censor. The phrase, "keep your laces modest," might have been the ancient Roman way of saying, "stay in your lane." And yes, there were literal laws about shoelaces. Senatorial calcii had specific colored straps, dyed deep red, a color imported at great cost from the East, extracted from Kermes beetles. That's right, a million crushed bugs, also one guy's feet could whisper, "I'm better than you," to the forum tiles. You cross paths with a group of equestrians heading toward the basilica. You can spot them by their narrow striped tunics and clean, but faceless, shoes. One looks wistfully at a senator's footwear like a kid staring at a sports car. He'll never wear those shoes unless he joins the Senate, or marries into it and hopes for a generous father-in-law, or starts a war, wins, and parades elephants down the Via Sacra. The usual options. You reach the cursus honorum, or at least the engraved plaque that lists it. It's Rome's political obstacle course, carved in stone for the ambitious and the masochistic. Quaestor, aedile, praetor, consul. Climb each rung, gain new privileges, new expectations, and new shoes. Only by reaching the Senate could you earn those symbolic calcii with the grim-faced embellishments. They were almost like wearable CVs. People could tell at a glance who you were, how high you'd climbed, and how likely you were to backstab your cousin at next Tuesday's vote. Some calcii bore not only faces but tiny inscriptions, initials of family names, house symbols, or in one case, a hidden line from Virgil under the tongue flap. Fortune favors the bold. Which, honestly, is bold when you're already wearing a shoe with your grandfather's scowl. But the rules cut the other way too. Slaves? No shoes at all. They walked barefoot, unless given basic sandals as a symbol of household status. Freedmen could wear shoes, yes, but plain ones. No colors, no ribbons, and absolutely no faces. A freedman caught in ornate calcii could be whipped or publicly shamed, depending on how badly the magistrate's day was going. Women. That's another story entirely. Wealthy Roman women wore shoes that rivaled their husbands in material, but differed in design. No faces, but plenty of animal motifs. Lions, peacocks, even dolphins, symbols of beauty, fertility, and maybe one-upmanship at brunch. One matron famously commissioned shoes with tiny Eros wings flaring from the heel. Not quite Nike, but close. Still no faces. Never faces. That belonged to the Senate. To wear them without a title would be like forging a passport made of calfskin and audacity. And you wonder, how many people faked it? Because where there are rules, there are rebels. You duck into a bathhouse and overhear two young men whispering about a party. He wore calcii with a Minerva face. One says, eyes wide. But he's not even on the council. The horror. The scandal. The footwear fraud. Apparently, there was even an underground market for imitation senatorial shoes. Cheap leather, mass-produced. Used mostly by actors in political satire plays, or ambitious courtesans trying to impress senators from the ankles up. There's even a weird little footnote in a scholar's diary that mentions a satirical play where a drunken goat is made a senator and given golden calcii with an angry goat face. Historians still argue whether this was metaphor, actual theater, or just what happens when wine gets too strong and the playwright's debt's too high. You step back into the street and suddenly, you see everyone's shoes differently. Not as footwear, but as masks. Codes. Badges. Some meant to dazzle, others meant to remind you to know your place. The cobbler's art had become a bureaucrat's weapon. And there's the rub. Rome didn't just use clothes to divide. It used shoes to anchor identity. And for senators, that identity had to be serious. Grave. Ancestral. So yes, their calcii bore stern, disapproving faces. Because Rome was watching. And those feet had to walk straight. Not just across the Senate floor, but into history. You feel the sweat pool at the back of your neck. It's not the sun. It's the weight of all this order, formality, hierarchy. So many rules, and all of them start from the ground up. You're leaning against a column now, just outside the Senate House, your feet sore and your thoughts tangled. The sun is high, casting sharp lines across the forum stones. And you suddenly wonder, who came up with the idea of putting faces on shoes in the first place? Why a face? And whose face was it? Was it a message? A protection spell? Or just one of those Roman things, like naming your son after your brother, who was also named after your father, who all happened to be named Gaius? You look down at the rough sandals on a passing merchant. Basic, honest footwear. Nothing fancy. Then you glance at a senator's assistant striding toward the Senate House in crisp white tunic, and yes, those deep red leather calcii with the eerie, sculpted face stitched onto the tongue. Not a smiling face. Definitely not that. It's the kind of face that could frown you into behaving. Stoic. Proud. A bit judgy. Like your grandfather when you reached for a second fig tart at dinner. Now let's get one thing straight. Roman senators didn't invent the idea of decorative footwear. They borrowed ideas from the Etruscans, the Greeks, even the Persians. Rome was like a very ambitious magpie, always picking shiny things from other cultures. The Etruscans, in particular, loved ornate shoes. High-heeled, curled-toe monstrosities made from dyed leather, and sometimes even bronze. But they didn't typically put faces on them. That seems to be Rome's contribution. And not just any faces, either. Historians still argue whether these faces were meant to depict specific ancestors, like your dead Uncle Marcus, immortalized on your toe, or whether they were generic ancestral archetypes, meant to symbolize lineage, duty, and extremely uncomfortable arch support. There's even a theory that they weren't human faces at all, but the face of Roma herself, the spirit of the state, given a form that would literally tread over enemies and dissenters alike. You pass a shrine as the bells toll softly, and an elderly woman in wool wraps drops an offering at the base. A small wooden carving. What else? A face. This time on a mask, meant to ward off the evil eye. You begin to wonder whether the faces on senatorial shoes had a similar purpose. Not to impress, but to protect. Shoes were closer to the ground, after all, which meant they were closer to danger. Curses, spilled blood, and all the things that live between the cobblestones. Romans were superstitious. Paranoid even. They believed that danger could seep up from the earth, infecting you through your feet. There were prayers for safe walking, for peaceful footsteps, for not being hexed by the dirt under your toes. Some fringe scholars claim that the faces were talismans, meant to protect senators from stepping on cursed soil or inadvertently angering some minor household deity lurking in a puddle. Fringe theory? Maybe. But this is a city where crocodile dung was used as sunscreen and chicken guts determined military strategy. Anything's possible. You sit on a bench near the Basilica Emilia, its marble still bearing the stains of a long-forgotten massacre, and think about those shoes. You can imagine the artisan who first stitched a face onto a pair of calcii. Some cobbler with a sense of humor, perhaps, or a whispered commission from a senator trying to outdo his rivals. It must have caught on slowly at first. A novelty, then a trend, then a requirement. And once something becomes a Roman requirement, it gets enshrined in law faster than you can say veto. There are preserved fragments from a senatorial edict in the reign of Augustus that describe official dress protocol. The calcii senatorii, senatorial shoes, were to be made of red leather, laced halfway up the shin and adorned with a lunula-shaped ornament, and sometimes a caput or face, stitched or molded into the tongue. Whether that face was sculpted, embossed, or painted, well, it probably depended on your budget. Just like today's designer shoes. Some senators went full extra. One was reported to have pearls embedded in the eyes of his shoe face. Another commissioned gold leaf around the mouth. You could say these were early experiments in designer branding. Forget swooshes or check marks. Rome had tiny scowling ancestors on your feet. And this wasn't limited to Rome proper. Archaeologists digging in Pompeii found fragments of shoes with facial embossments too. Proof that the fashion had spread, or maybe that senators traveled with their wardrobe. After all, a senator without his shoes was just a man in a bathrobe yelling in Latin. But here's where things get really interesting. Not all the faces looked the same. Some had beards, some didn't. Some were smiling, rare. And a few had features that resembled known busts of family patriarchs. There's one surviving shoe fragment, now in the Naples Museum, that has a leather face almost identical to the bust of Cato the Elder. If it was custom-made, then Cato literally walked all over Rome wearing himself. You can't help but chuckle. Imagine stepping in something gross with your own face. Poetic, really. Still, not everyone found it funny. There were voices in the Senate who hated the trend. Letters from Cicero's circle reveal at least one senator, Servilius Rufus, who called the shoes a vanity unworthy of Rome's virtues. He supposedly wore plain calcii and mocked others for marching on marble with the dead on their toes. But most senators? They embraced it. The Roman elite had a long history of putting faces on things. Coins, statues, signet rings, death masks. Adding them to shoes was just one more way of announcing to the world, I come from greatness. Also, please don't step on me. And the irony? Most Romans didn't even get to see these fancy faces. The tongues were hidden by the folds of the toga, visible only when a senator stepped or sat a certain way. They were like secret flexes, meant not for the crowd, but for fellow elites. A quiet nod between peers that said, I too wear the face. Your own feet throb now, as if aware they've never worn anything more impressive than rubber soles and questionable socks. But in your mind, you slip on those calcii. You feel the stiff leather hug your ankles, the carved face pressing into the top of your foot like a stamp of legitimacy. You walk taller. You walk slower. You walk like Rome is watching. And maybe, just maybe, it is. You duck beneath an ivy-draped archway to escape the sun, your thoughts still spinning from the idea that senators might have been walking around with their grandfather's face strapped to their feet. But Rome doesn't do weird for weird's sake. There's always a reason, even if it's deeply buried beneath 3 layers of politics, ego, and ancient superstition. You lean against the wall, gaze trailing over the worn marble plaques that dot the forum, and let your mind wander to what those shoes actually meant symbol-wise. Not just in terms of fashion or flair, but as serious, deliberate status indicators. Here's the thing, Rome was obsessed with class. Like Olympic-level obsessed. Everything, your name, your clothes, even the number of rings you could legally wear, signaled your place in the rigid social pecking order. So when a senator walked past in his red leather, face-adorned calcii, he wasn't just making a fashion statement. He was announcing, in no uncertain terms, I belong to the ruling class. I have lineage. And yes, I walk with the weight of the republic on my face, foot. Historians still argue whether the red dye used on senatorial calcii came from imported Phoenician murex snails. Yes, snails, or whether local sources were used. Either way, that deep, blood-colored hue was expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Commoners couldn't afford it. Slaves couldn't wear it. Soldiers didn't dare scuff it. So the moment you saw those red shoes, boom. Authority, privilege, power. And those faces? They were like personalized insignias. Imagine the modern senator's fancy pin or an embossed monogram on a suitcase. Except, leather-molded cheekbones on your left foot. You stroll past a pair of statues now, one missing its head, the other leaning precariously to the right, and remember that Roman footwear wasn't just regulated, it was legislated. The infamous sumptuary laws governed everything from how much gold a woman could wear to what kind of shoes you could strut around in. The law Lex Appia from 215 BCE originally passed to curb luxurious spending during wartime, even tried to ban extravagant footwear altogether. People lost their minds. The backlash was so intense it was repealed 2 decades later. Because, let's be real, Romans loved their drip. Still, senatorial shoes were in a class of their own. The calceus senatorius became as recognizable as the toga. You couldn't show up to the Senate barefoot. That would be like attending Parliament in your bathrobe, or worse, in sneakers with anime prints. These shoes were the final touch, the last ceremonial piece that declared, I represent Rome. But it wasn't just about senators flaunting status. These shoes also communicated to everyone else how not to act. If you weren't a senator and you wore calcii with the wrong color or decorations, you'd get fined, or flogged, or, in some cases, just dragged through the streets by your bootstraps, literally. And because this is Rome, nothing about the rules was casual. There was an entire office, the censors, responsible for enforcing behavior, morality, and yes, appropriate wardrobe. If a censor saw you rocking red calcii without a Senate appointment, you could kiss your family's honor goodbye. Forget Instagram cancellation. This was full-on ancestral disgrace. Your grandkids would still be apologizing. You turn down a quieter alley, the kind where ivy grows thick and the air smells like damp stone and olives, and imagine the daily ritual of a senator dressing. First the tunic, then the toga, perfectly folded by a slave trained in the 17-step wrap technique. And finally, the calcii, stiff and scarlet, the leather face gleaming just beneath the laces. A senator wouldn't bend to tie them himself, of course. That job went to a household slave, sometimes called a pedicquis, or foot follower. He'd lace up the shoes with the same reverence someone today might reserve for polishing a vintage Rolex. The face had to be centered, the leather smoothed, the laces pulled tight, but not too tight. After all, you didn't want to offend your ancestral ghost by giving him blisters. There's a letter from Pliny the Younger, Rome's favorite gossip columnist in senatorial robes, describing how his uncle dressed with grave attention to footwear. According to Pliny, one senator became so obsessed with getting the right arch support under the ancestral face on his shoe that he had a cobbler summoned mid-Senate session. Priorities, right? And don't even get started on the ceremonial aspect. If you were attending a public funeral, those shoes had to be spotless. You couldn't parade your dead colleague through the forum with dusty feet. It would dishonor the deceased and potentially curse your lineage. Some even claim that certain calcii were kept just for funerals, never worn otherwise. These had exaggerated faces, painted eyes, or even feathered brows. Because nothing says respect like wearing an angry leather face to a burial. And here's your quirky tidbit of the night. At least one preserved baby-sized calceus has been found, with a tiny embossed face. Historians are still scratching their heads over that one. Was it a rich kid's training shoe? A ceremonial miniature? Or, as one fringe scholar proposed, A fertility charm disguised as footwear? Yes, a baby's shoe with a face, possibly blessed by a priestess of Juno. You can't make this stuff up. Unless you're Livy, then you absolutely can. You reach a shaded courtyard where a fountain bubbles lazily, and the calm is infectious. You imagine a senator sitting here, legs crossed, examining his shoes like they hold secrets. Maybe they do. Maybe they whispered confidence into his stride, reminded him of his father's victories, or of Rome's eternal presence underfoot. Or maybe he just liked the way they made the junior senators stare. And oh, they stared. Status envy was real. Senators could size each other up in seconds based on the tone of red, the complexity of the face stitch, or even how recently the leather had been oiled. There are sarcastic verses in juvenile satires poking fun at one senator who shined his shoes more than he shined in debate. Ouch. But here's the beautiful absurdity. For all the face-bearing shoes, leather dyes, and unwritten fashion feuds, these symbols only mattered if people believed in them. Rome ran on belief. In traditions. In omens. In status. And if you walked into the Senate barefoot, even with the best speech in the world, you might as well have been invisible. So you stretch your legs, yawn, and picture yourself lacing up a pair of calcii. The red is dark and glossy. The face? Stoic, sure, but a bit smug, just like you'd want. And with each step, it feels like Rome herself is guiding your path. Or at least keeping your feet really, really judgmental. You walk through a quiet courtyard now, where the birdsong bounces gently off crumbling columns, and you start to notice something odd about the way senators are remembered. Not their votes, not their speeches, not even their scandals, but their shoes. See, when a Roman senator died, especially the well-loved or well-feared kind, his body was paraded through the forum in a grand funeral procession. You might think this was all about the corpse, but you'd be wrong. The star of the show? The actors. Yes, actors. Professional mourners, dressed in full regalia, would impersonate the senator's ancestors. They'd wear masks molded after long-dead family members, complete with long noses or stern frowns. And they'd even dress in the traditional garments each ancestor was known for. And yes, that included the shoes. That meant if the senator's great-grandfather wore a particular kind of calceus with a distinct leather face, the actor would wear an identical pair. You pass beneath a cypress tree, the shade soothing, and picture the whole scene. Rows of impersonators, marching in solemn rhythm, their scarlet shoes clicking in time with the funeral drums. Each shoe face, carefully crafted to match the ancestor being resurrected. A weird combination of Broadway and the Day of the Dead, just with more red leather and zero dancing. And the crowd? They weren't just mourning. They were taking notes. Every shoe told a story. Every face on those shoes whispered, "This family has ruled for generations." They remember. They endure. Historians still argue whether the shoe faces used in funerals were handcrafted for each actor or passed down through the generations like a family crest. Either way, it was about visibility. In Rome, death wasn't a curtain call, it was a final resume. And if you were anyone of note, your legacy had to be dressed correctly. It gets weirder. Some families, obsessed with preserving status, kept entire ancestor wardrobes in their homes. Robes, breastplates, masks, and yes, the sacred shoes. You'd have these in a special cupboard, guarded like treasure. Not because anyone would wear them to the market, but because they were literal symbols of bloodline legitimacy. Want to prove you descend from old senators? Don't pull out a birth certificate. Show them the shoes. You rub your temples. Rome could be exhausting like that. But what's fascinating is how this tradition bled into the political process. Let's say you're a young noble aiming for a seat in the Senate. You can't just show up with good ideas and a tight toga. You need visual proof that you belong. So what do? You dig up your great-granduncle's funeral shoes. Maybe shine up the worn leather face. You wear them around, subtle but visible. You let the older senators notice. They do. And suddenly, you're not just Gaius who reads well. You're Gaius whose uncle marched with Scipio. Gaius who carries his lineage on his feet. That's currency. Of course, not everyone bought into it. Some philosophers mocked the whole tradition. Seneca, bless his withering sarcasm, once wrote that a man may have noble shoes and a noble name, but still walk like a fool. Touché, Seneca. Still, most Romans weren't joking. The shoes were part of a bigger picture. Because beneath all the pomp, Rome was terrified of losing its memory. Imagine living in a world without photographs, without video, without easy archives. If someone wasn't remembered by name, face, or footwear, they might as well never have lived. That's why memory had to be performed, on stages, in funerals, through rituals. And in shoes. You wander past a statue of a senator now, 1 foot forward, carved in mid-step. And yep, there it is. The outline of a calceus, complete with faint face details on the toe. It hits you that sculptors didn't do this just for fun. They were recording history. The shoes helped the viewer place the person. This was a senator, not a merchant. A descendant, not a pretender. But it wasn't just about who wore them. It was also about how they wore them. Shoes were meant to be polished. Maintained. Some sources mention special waxes used by Roman cobblers, blended with goat fat and crushed myrtle berries, to keep the red leather supple. Neglected shoes? That was a sign of sloppiness. Worse, disrespect. One senator was once called out in public for wearing cracked calcei with flaking faces. The scandal was mild, sure, but in Rome, perception was everything. Your shoes had to speak before you did. Which brings us to another curious layer. Imitations. It turns out, even in ancient Rome, there were fashion fakes. Young men desperate to look like senators would sometimes have knockoff face shoes made. Cheaper leather, shoddier dye, lopsided features. One poor guy was reportedly caught wearing a mismatched pair. One face was clearly female. He claimed it was an artistic tribute to his mother. No one bought it. He got booted, pun intended, from the forum. It's easy to laugh, but can you blame them? If the path to power starts with footwear, who wouldn't fake it to make it? You glance down at your own shoes, maybe just slippers in the dark or warm socks beneath your blanket, and try to imagine how heavy those Roman shoes must have felt. Not just physically, but symbolically. You weren't just walking for yourself. You were walking for every ancestor whose name echoed in the marble corridors of the Senate. Every shoe print was a legacy impression. And those shoes hurt. Roman shoes didn't come with arch support. They didn't flex. They didn't forgive. You wore them not for comfort, but for meaning. Even the face on the shoe didn't look happy. Stoic, yes. Intimidating, definitely. Like someone who disapproves of both your politics and your lunch choices. It's said that a senator once commissioned shoes with his own face on them while still alive. Just to send a message. Remember me now, not just when I'm dead. That kind of narcissism wasn't even frowned upon. It was expected. Because in Rome, self-mythology wasn't vanity. It was strategy. Now imagine this. You're 10 years old, watching your father dress for the Senate. You see the face shoes slide on. You feel the weight of tradition. One day, those shoes will be yours. Not in a sweet, Hallmark wife following in his footsteps way. No, literally, they will hand you his shoes. And you'll be expected to carry his memory through every street, every vote, every ceremonial march. And if you scuff them, good luck explaining that to his ghost. You step into a cool Roman atrium, the kind with polished floors and the gentle splashing of a central fountain. The air smells faintly of olive oil and warm wax, and you're suddenly surrounded by quiet whispers, not from people, but from statues. Marble busts on pedestals, eyes wide open, mouths forever closed. They're not alone. You look down, and there they are again, the shoes. But this time they're miniature, carved into the base of each statue. Yes, even in stone, the shoes with faces remain. Why? Because Romans didn't just wear their history, they archived it in the weirdest ways. Take the tradition of ancestral Laras and Penates, the household gods. Every Roman home had a shrine, and while most people kept simple figurines of their family spirits, the elites took it up a notch. Some created tiny replicas of ancestor regalia, including ceremonial shoes with faces. Like action figures, but for dead relatives. A little creepy? Absolutely. But also deeply Roman. And here's where it gets properly strange. You peek into a senator's private study, and there's something resting in a box lined with wool. A pair of ancient calcei, shriveled with age, their leather hardened like tree bark. The faces are still visible, smoothed by time, but watching. These weren't worn anymore. They were relics. Family members believed the shoes held echoes of the wearer's spirit. You didn't bury them. You kept them, protected them. Sometimes you whispered to them. A senator might even bring the shoes to important decisions. Not to wear them, no, but to consult them. Would father approve of this law? The senator asks, holding the shoes in his lap like talismans. Would grandfather strike this deal with gall? Historians still argue whether this was a private spiritual habit or part of broader ancestral worship. But either way, it makes your lucky socks feel woefully underdressed. Now, if the idea of haunted footwear isn't enough, picture this. When a senator died in battle and his body was unrecovered, some families held symbolic funerals. They'd bury his calcii instead of his remains. The shoes, not the man, received the farewell rites. In a world where dying without proper ceremony meant wandering the afterlife in limbo, this was a big deal. But not all ghost shoes were passive. There's a lesser-known folktale that circulated in the Subura district, Rome's edgiest, noisiest neighborhood. It told of a senator who wronged his family and died in disgrace. His descendants tried to rid themselves of his memory. They burned his documents, smashed his bust, and tossed his calcii into the Tiber. Bad move. According to the tale, the shoes floated back to shore and ended up on the steps of their villa, twice. Servants reported hearing footsteps at night, heavy and echoing, despite empty hallways. Eventually, a new statue of the disgraced ancestor was commissioned, and the shoes were placed beneath it. The haunting stopped. Now, obviously, it's just a story, probably whispered by kids who wanted to freak out their cousins during dinner. But still, how many bedtime stories do you know about cursed footwear? You shake your head and refocus. Let's go back to the living. Inside the Senate house, shoes had their own kind of etiquette. You weren't just wearing them, you were performing. Roman orators were trained in everything: hand gestures, eye contact, posture. But did you know some also trained in how to stand in their shoes? A powerful orator knew that even the way he shifted his weight could send a message. A slow step forward meant challenge. A pivot with a glance backward? Uncertainty. One senator became famous for the way he angled, his foot at rivals while addressing the chamber, just enough for the shoe face to catch their gaze. A subtle insult. A statement of ancestral disapproval. Passive-aggressive footwear, 101. Of course, the Senate also had its own floors, marble, slick, unforgiving. And if you slipped? Oh, buddy, that was a moment. One famous account tells of a senator who stumbled during a heated debate and fell flat, face down, his shoe portraits sticking up in the air like disapproving masks. The laughter was legendary. So were the cartoons scratched onto tavern walls afterward. His political career? Yeah, not so much. And here's something fun. Archaeologists once found shoe prints inside the Curia Julia, the Senate building, that were surprisingly small. Children-sized. Turns out senators in training, young noble boys, were sometimes brought inside for shadowing. And yes, they wore miniature versions of their father's shoes. Faces and all. Political cosplay, ancient edition. But beyond the walls of power, these shoes started showing up in religious festivals. There's one called the Lemuria, a spooky annual ritual where families tried to appease angry ancestral spirits. One rite involved tossing black beans over your shoulder at night while chanting, "With these beans, I redeem me and mine." But some families took it further. They placed the ancestral shoes by the doorway during the ritual, facing outward. Why? To show the spirits a path out. Literal exit signs, fashioned from leather and memory. You picture a family of 4, nervously laying out a pair of cracked red calcii by candlelight. The mother clutches her rosary. The father whispers the chant. The toddler tries to poke the shoe faces. A modern family trying to survive an ancient haunting. It's both hilarious and haunting. And speaking of modern, some Italian noble families today still keep weird artifacts from their Roman ancestors. Sword hilts, clay seals, and yep, fragments of ceremonial shoes. One museum in Naples displays a child-sized Roman sandal with a carved lion face on the toe. It's been debated endlessly. Was it for a senator's son? A mini ceremonial piece? A rich kid's custom request? Historians still argue whether Roman children mimicked senatorial dress, just for festivals, or as part of early political grooming. All you know is it's adorable and mildly terrifying, like a toddler in a 3-piece suit giving a campaign speech. So now you start to feel it, that creeping sense that Roman shoes weren't just about power or ancestry. They were a conversation, between the living and the dead, between memory and ambition, between what you wore and what you meant. You brush your fingers over the air in front of you, almost like you're lacing up your own pair. The weight settles in. You understand that wearing the face shoes wasn't about comfort, wasn't about trend. It was about continuity, telling the world, I am not alone. I carry ghosts with style. And maybe, just maybe, you'd better treat your own sneakers with a bit more respect. You don't remember walking out of the Senate, but here you are, trailing a senator along the cobbled Via Sacra, the sacred way, Rome's most celebrated street. His gait is confident, a bit stiff, and his shoes, those glorious face-stamped calcii, are polished to a high shine. Not just for style, but because every step is a statement. Even the dust respects him. And it has to, because this isn't a random stroll. This is a procession. Roman society loved a good parade. Especially triumphs, the ultimate flex. When a general crushed enemies and returned home victorious, the Senate could award him a triumph. A citywide celebration where the conquering hero would ride a chariot through the streets in full regalia. Behind him marched soldiers, exotic animals, prisoners, looted treasure. And if he was a senator, his calcii with faces walked ahead of him like royalty. On foot. On purpose. You think about that for a second. A man just won a war, but the first thing people noticed? His shoes. That's how embedded this footwear was in Rome's theater of power. Historians still argue whether the shoes worn in triumphs were the same day-to-day calcii, or if a separate, ceremonial pair was created just for the occasion. What's clear is that the shoe's face, always stylized to resemble the wearer's patron god or ancestor, acted like a walking prayer. Or a subtle flex. Hey, Jupiter thinks I look good today. Just saying. And the public noticed. Children mimicked the walk. Artisans carved miniature shoe-shaped amulets to sell on street corners. Women tried to create fashionable spin-offs. You see a merchant pushing a cart full of cheap knockoffs, slippers with crudely painted faces and slogans like "For Fortuna's sake," or "Step with Mars." Capitalism, baby. But not everyone was amused. The Stoics, Rome's most eyebrow-arched philosophers, were not fans of footwear that talked back. They believed the calcii with faces were a vanity, a distraction from virtue. A man should be judged by his actions, Seneca once said, not by his toes. You imagine him scowling at the sight of a particularly smug sandal and muttering. Degeneracy begins at the feet. Still, even Stoics couldn't escape the allure completely. One fringe account claims that Epictetus, the famously humble Stoic teacher, secretly owned a worn-out pair of calcii with tiny owl faces on them. His personal nod to Minerva, goddess of wisdom. He never wore them in public, of course, just for pacing in his study. You can picture it, a philosopher shuffling in circles, whispering deep thoughts while cartoon owls blink up from his saws. Even philosophers need their quirks. Back on the street, you pass a young nobleman kneeling at a roadside shrine. He places a coin in the offering bowl, then adjusts his shoes. The faces are nearly smirking, mischievous, not divine. You realize they're modeled after Mercury, god of speed and commerce. A clever choice for a man with political ambitions. And that's the thing, the faces weren't always solemn. Some were playful. Some were deliberately intimidating. Others were flattering self-portraits, like mini mirrors to remind everyone. Yep, that's me. On my foot. Deal with it. Romans understood branding centuries before Instagram. One famous example, Gaius Flavius Albus, a senator known for his oratory and very punchable face. He commissioned a set of calcii with his own likeness sculpted into the toes, mouth slightly open, as if always mid-debate. The shoes were so notorious that political cartoons, yes, Rome had those, often in the form of graffiti, depicted rival senators stomping on them. Literal takedowns. Unfortunately for Gaius, his shoes outlived his popularity. After a scandal involving embezzlement and, believe it or not, donkey racing bets, he was exiled. But his face shoes remained in circulation, passed around by jesters and used as props in underground plays. Once a power symbol, now a punchline. It's a reminder, Rome's shoes could make you, but they could also mock you. And mockery was never far from politics. You duck into a shadowy tavern near the Aventine Hill. Inside, amid the smells of wine and roasted garlic, a crowd gathers for an illegal satirical performance. On stage, a comedian wears oversized calcii with exaggerated, bug-eyed faces. Every time he kicks, the audience roars. "Look," he shouts, pointing to the shoes. "Even my feet think the Senate's full of it." Laughter erupts. Coins clink into a bowl. And you catch sight of something surprising. A pair of real senators in the back corner, watching through their cloaks, smirking. Even they know the power of footwear performance. Even ridicule has its place in the Roman rhythm. You step back outside as the sky turns to copper and gold. Rome at sunset is softer, less sharp. And your gaze drops again, always, to the feet of those around you. Merchants in worn sandals. Soldiers in hobnailed boots. Aristocrats in polished calcii with subtle, tasteful faces. The shoes are no longer just clothes. They're commentary. Identity. Memory. Humor. One particularly fascinating tidbit from fringe archaeology: A lone sandal was found near the remains of a villa outside Pompeii. What made it strange wasn't just that it had a face stitched into it, but that the face had a tear rolling down one cheek. Not a joke, not a scowl, a tear. Historians still argue whether it was a mourning shoe, a theatrical costume piece, or an eerie coincidence frozen in ash. But it tells you something vital. Even a face on a shoe could carry emotion. Now your mind drifts to modern times. A senator's calcii would probably show up as a limited edition sneaker collab. SBQR Air Max 47s, complete with marble-textured soles and ancestral NFTs. TikTok would break under the pressure of so many ancient drip checks. But you've walked enough for one night. You imagine taking off a pair of Roman shoes at the end of a long day. The leather creaks as it releases your foot. The face and the toe relaxes, no longer pressed into service. You set them beside your bed, not out of superstition, but respect. Because now you understand. To walk in Rome wasn't just to move. It was to declare, to remember, to perform. And whether it's a grieving face hidden in ash or a smug senator's likeness on a sandal, one truth remains. The Romans never let their feet be boring. You wake up, or maybe you never slept, and find yourself in a quieter part of the city. The bustle of triumphs and street parades fades behind you. Instead, you follow a winding alley toward a courtyard tucked between domed villas. It's serene here, heavy with the scent of pine resin and stone warmed by the afternoon sun. And at the center of it all, a workshop. Not just any workshop. This is where the faces on senators' shoes are born. You slip inside, ducking under a hanging curtain of dyed linen. The air smells of glue, leather, and singed hair. A dozen artisans work in near silence, their fingers stained with ochre and oil. On the benches, wooden molds, carving tools, half-stitched sawls. Hanging from the rafters like quiet sentinels, rows upon rows of calcii, their toe faces waiting patiently. This is where the magic happens. Well, magic mixed with a fair amount of sweat and sewing. The Romans were obsessed with craft, especially when it came to footwear, which had to straddle function, flair, and formality. You watch a young apprentice shape a toe box, pressing a leather panel against a cast of a senator's chosen visage. The features are subtle: arched brows, a neutral mouth, eyes that don't blink but seem to know too much. One wrong stitch, and the whole expression changes. Too much cheek, and it looks like he's smirking, the master shoemaker grumbles. Too little, and he looks bored. Senators hate looking bored. You nod like you totally understand, but you're mostly impressed that shoe design here borders on portraiture. Mainstream historians agree that the calceus senatorius, the formal senatorial shoe, followed strict design codes. Red leather, mid-calf height, laced up the front. But here's the lesser-known twist. Many of them also bore faces of deities, ancestors, or abstract expressions of Roman virtues. And while not every senator wore them, those who did often commissioned them from specialist workshops like this one. You look closer and realize the tools resemble those of jewelers more than cobblers. Tiny awls, gold-tipped styluses, even a little bronze comb used to texture the hair on a face. The shoes weren't just footwear. They were art installations that went everywhere their owner did. One quirky tidbit: wealthy senators sometimes competed not just on whose face was better carved, but who could hide secret messages in their shoe designs. A nose shaped like a dolphin hinted at naval victories. An eyebrow resembling a laurel leaf whispered of recent honors. It was a silent language of elite inside jokes, broadcast on their feet. Of course, not every artisan approved. You overhear one old cobbler mumble, "Feet weren't made to be egos." He's shaping a basic pair, plain brown, no embellishments, for a lower magistrate. His hands move automatically, but his eyes flick toward the fancier pairs with visible disdain. It's clear, even in Rome, shoe snobbery was alive and well. You pause near a workbench covered in charcoal sketches. There's a rough outline of a boot toe with the face of Janus, the god of beginnings and endings, the two-faced deity. Literally two faces stitched into one shoe. You squint. The faces look like they're whispering to each other. Historians still argue whether this design was ever actually worn or whether it was satire, an artisan's jab at duplicitous senators. Either way, it's brilliant. You imagine a senator striding through the forum, each step announcing, "I'm honest and also not." But here's something surprising. Shoemaking was one of the few professions in Rome where slaves, freedmen, and citizens often worked side by side. Skill trumped status, at least in the workshop. Some of the most renowned calcii with faces were made by freed craftsmen, whose names still appear on tiny stamps hidden inside the soles. One such stamp, Felix Fakit, has turned up on multiple archaeological digs. Felix made it, short, proud, defiant. Imagine leaving your name not on a monument, but tucked under a senator's arch. A whisper beneath power. As you wander deeper into the shop, you spot a wall covered in tiny wooden busts, mini models used to plan shoe designs. Most are classical, stern gods, noble ancestors, the occasional lion. But one catches your eye. It's clearly modeled after the artisan himself. Balding, tired, a big, proud nose. You gesture to it. The nearest apprentice shrugs and grins. Sometimes we make one for ourselves, to remember who we are. That sticks with you. Because as much as senators used shoes with faces to project status and legacy, the artisans made them to reclaim identity too. To carve themselves into history, one step at a time. Suddenly, the workshop door bursts open, and in marches a harried messenger. He carries a scroll bearing an urgent commission. A new senator wants 6 pairs of calcii with different expressions: calm, wrathful, wise, mournful, amused, and proud. He's indecisive, the messenger admits. Wants options. The master shoemaker groans, but nods. Work begins immediately. You wonder what kind of man needs 6 faces for his feet. Maybe one who doesn't know his own. Outside the workshop, the sun dips low. The alley is quiet again. You hear soft laughter. An apprentice giggling at a pair of rejected shoes with cross-eyed faces. "These made a senator fall down the stairs once," he says, shaking his head. Bad juju. Even among professionals, superstition lingers. Some believe badly carved faces bring bad luck. Others insist shoes should never smile too broadly. It's like daring the gods to humble you. You start to think, maybe that's why some senators preferred neutral expressions. Safer. Less cocky. More Roman. As you leave, you turn for one last look at the workshop. The door swings shut behind you, but the image stays. Rows of shoes lined like soldiers, each with its own personality. Some angry, some pensive, some daring you to laugh. All waiting to be stepped into. And just like that, the sound of hammering fades. You're back on Rome's uneven stones, your own imaginary calcii whispering underfoot. One toe smirks. The other raises an eyebrow. You walk on. The sun's warmth softens as you wander toward the heart of the forum again. But this time your steps carry you into the buzzing debates and whispered intrigues where those very shoes, the calcii with faces, make their grandest appearances. You see senators striding through marble columns, their feet draped in those crimson leather wonders that hold more secrets than you ever imagined. Picture this. A senator stands, his feet firmly planted, faces on his shoes glaring back at you with stoic solemnity. Around him, the crowd waits, some curious, others skeptical. You lean in, hearing fragments of heated arguments and knowing nods, but your eyes never stray from those faces on his toes. They speak louder than his voice, telling stories, boasting ancestry, signaling power. It wasn't just about decoration. Shoes were political theater. Historians have long agreed that the calceus senatorius was a signifier of rank, dignity, and sometimes family legacy. The red dye alone was reserved for the elite, symbolizing not only wealth, but the blood of Rome itself. But the faces? They added layers of meaning, even a bit of intimidation. Imagine walking into the Senate chamber, your shoes' faces catching every glance, some pleading loyalty, others daring opposition. But you also catch the occasional snicker, those sly Roman wits who saw the shoes as a bit much, a sort of theatrical absurdity. You overhear a senator mutter, "Next, they'll want faces on their togas." And indeed, fringe sources hint that a few senators did try adding embroidery of faces on clothing, though it never quite caught on. Historians still argue whether those flamboyant experiments were genuine trends or just rumors spun by satirists like Juvenal and Martial, poking fun at the elite's vanity. Speaking of vanity, here's the quirky bit. Some senators supposedly had their own facial expressions carved onto their shoes to mimic mood swings during debates. A scowl when discussing war, a smile when talking trade, a raised eyebrow for diplomacy. No one knows if this was widespread or just the stuff of gossip, but it paints a wonderfully ridiculous picture. Imagine a room full of men stepping in and out of moods, their shoes leading the way. You imagine the practical challenges, too. Wouldn't a shoe with a particularly fierce face cause more enemies? Or worse, spark laughter during solemn moments? Romans were serious about their gravitas, after all. But maybe that was the point. The faces were subtle power plays. A silent, "I am here," without uttering a word. Like a secret handshake, but with leather and stitching. Your mind drifts to the workshops again. You wonder about the artisans' role as political influencers. Did they push for bolder designs to curry favor? Or did they quietly refuse certain commissions, wary of the message a face might send? The line between art and propaganda seems thin, blurred by layers of leather and lore. You spot a young senator nearby. He shifts nervously, glancing down at his shiny red shoes. The faces are unusually delicate, almost shy. You overhear a companion joke. Those toes don't dare speak up in debate. And suddenly, you see the shoes as more than status symbols. Maybe they were talismans, reminders to walk carefully through politics, lest your footwear betray your true feelings. Interestingly, some scholars suggest that the tradition of face-decorated footwear inspired later European aristocracy's penchant for decorative heels and embroidered boots. The Roman Calceus might have set a precedent for wearing your status on your feet that echoes through centuries, though historians still debate how direct that influence truly was. You chuckle softly, imagining a Renaissance duke gazing at his own elaborate boots and thinking, "Ah yes, I too have faces on my toes, though no one quite sees them like in Rome." The chatter around you fades as you focus back on the senators. Faces on shoes weren't just a quirk of fashion. They were a language, a statement, a power play stitched into leather. And in a city where words were weapons, the subtle art of shoe decoration was a battlefield you'd never want to underestimate. So next time you look down at your own shoes, maybe you'll wonder, what story do they tell? What faces do they wear when no one's watching? You smile, ready to keep walking. Your footsteps echo softly along the paved stones as you drift from the marble grandeur of the Forum into the quieter, less formal spaces where senators relax and scheme away from prying eyes. Here, the shoes take on a different life, a playful, sometimes rebellious one. The calcei with faces become more than ceremonial symbols. They turn into personal statements, nearly a gossip magnet. You find yourself in a small tavern favored by politicians after hours. The air is thick with wine and whispers, the faint smell of roasted dormice drifting from the kitchen. Senators kick off their sandals, propping their feet up, and the faces on their shoes catch the flickering candlelight, making the eyes seem almost alive, watching, judging, even laughing. One senator, a notorious prankster, sports shoes with faces deliberately crafted to look cross-eyed and goofy. His companions snicker, saying he's wearing his foolishness on his feet. But you can tell there's strategy behind the jest. By disarming his rivals with humor, he gains the upper hand in debates. It's political theater again, but this time with a wink. You remember reading that among the Romans, humor and satire were potent weapons. Comedians mocked public figures, poets penned biting epigrams, and apparently, shoe faces joined the arsenal. Historians still debate how widespread this trend was, whether such playful designs were exceptions or quietly accepted norms. The truth probably lies somewhere in between, and you can't help but smile at the idea of senators using footwear as subtle insults. But here's a curious and quirky fact. Some senators are said to have hidden small compartments inside their calcei. Yes, tiny secret pockets stitched beneath the soles or heels, perfect for smuggling messages, poison, or lucky charms. Imagine slipping a note to an ally under your shoe, all while maintaining the dignity of that stern face looking out from the toe. You catch the barkeep's eye, who nods knowingly and whispers, "Politics is a dirty game, but the shoes keep it classy." It's a reminder that beneath all the pageantry and faces, the real power plays happened in shadows. There's also a legend, more fringe than fact, that some shoes had actual faces molded from wax or even thin metal, which could be heated and reshaped to express different emotions. Like mood rings, but for feet. Whether this was practical or just another flourish no one wants to admit trying, historians still argue. If true, imagine a senator adjusting his shoe's expression before entering a debate. That's some next-level emotional control. As you sip your diluted wine, you watch a pair of older senators engage in a quiet contest of shoe faces. One's shoes have a proud lion's snout, the other a solemn eagle's beak. The subtle competition reminds you that these shoes were more than adornments. They were heraldic, tribal, a mobile family crest. And here's another twist. Some shoes bore the faces of long-dead ancestors, almost like walking memorials. Senators believed these faces could lend wisdom, courage, or even divine protection. Imagine stepping into your ancestors' gaze every morning, trying not to trip. The tavern buzz slows, the fire dies down, and the faces on those shoes seem to soften, as if settling in for the night. You realize that these shoes carried not just the weight of bodies, but of histories, secrets, ambitions, and dreams. When you finally step out into the night air, the moonlight catches the glint of a few scattered shoes left by the door. Faces staring up at the stars, silent witnesses to the stories of Rome's greatest players. You pull your cloak tighter and step into the shadows, ready to follow the next thread of this tangled tale. You wander further from the bustling streets and polished marble, slipping into the quiet alleys where the craftsmen live and breathe the city's lifeblood. The air here smells of leather and tanned hides, and the rhythmic tapping of hammers against anvils pulses like a heartbeat beneath the city's grandeur. This is where the real magic of the senator's shoes happens. The workshops where raw materials transform into powerful symbols. You peek through a dusty window and catch sight of a shoemaker bent over his workbench, carefully carving a face into the crimson leather. His hands move with practiced precision, the grooves and lines forming eyes, noses, and mouths that almost seem alive under the flickering oil lamp. Each face is unique, crafted to echo the senator's personality or ancestry. This is no mere footwear, it's wearable identity. The shoemaker pauses to dip a brush in a special dye, a secret recipe known only to a few, to highlight the features with shadows and highlights. This subtle artistry gives the faces a three-dimensional presence, making them seem to observe the world, judging with silent authority. It's a craft passed down through generations, often guarded like a family secret. Here's a mainstream historical nugget. The Romans were masters of symbolic dress. Senators' shoes were part of a larger ensemble designed to broadcast social status. Togas, rings, hairstyles, but the calcii with faces were uniquely powerful. They combined art, politics, and personality in one package. Historians still argue whether the shoemakers enjoyed any social status themselves, or were just anonymous cogs in the imperial machine. But then there's the quirky side. Some shoemakers were rumored to imbue their work with subtle curses or blessings. A stroke here or there might be intended to protect the wearer from envy or bad luck. You can almost imagine a shoemaker whispering a charm over the leather before sewing the pieces together. No one admits this openly, but the idea fits perfectly with the Romans' blend of superstition and politics. You catch a glimpse of a dusty scroll pinned to the workshop wall. It's a strange mixture of sketches, faces ranging from stern and fierce to playful and sly, along with annotations about personality traits and even astrological signs. Could the shoemaker have been some kind of ancient psychologist? Historians debate the exact role these annotations played, but you like to think there was more than craftsmanship here, an understanding of the human condition stitched into leather. Nearby, you hear a whispered story. One shoemaker allegedly crafted a pair of shoes with faces so lifelike, they were said to change expressions depending on the wearer's mood. An ancient version of today's mood rings, perhaps, or maybe just a fantastic exagger. Still, it sparks your imagination. You begin to notice how the faces differ, some wide-eyed and innocent, others sharp and hawkish. You realize that each face carries a message, a coded language only the initiated might fully understand. Maybe a sly wink means the senator is open to bribery. A grim set jaw means they are unyielding. The shoes, in a sense, spoke without words, broadcasting intentions and alliances in a city where mistrust was the currency. As you watch the shoemaker add the final touches, you wonder about the balance between art and utility. Were these shoes comfortable, durable, practical for the long Senate debates or the dusty roads? Probably not. But that wasn't the point. These shoes were armor for the soul, a public face worn quite literally on the feet. You leave the workshop with a new appreciation for the artistry and mystique behind those faces. It's clear that the calcii were more than fashion. They were a blend of politics, psychology, superstition, and craftsmanship all rolled into one. Your footsteps fade into the alley as the city's noises swell again, carrying you deeper into the secrets of Roman power. The night wraps around you like a soft cloak as you meander toward the Grand Villa district, where senators retreat after the forum's relentless bustle. Here, the faces on shoes take on yet another role, not just public statements, but intimate talismans within the privacy of their homes. You find yourself on a moonlit veranda, the scent of blooming jasmine mingling with faint traces of burnt olive oil from nearby lamps. The senator you imagine here is no mere figure of stone and oratory, but a man wrapped in layers of tradition and superstition. His calcii rest near the door, their faces almost serene under the pale light, as if watching over his household. One popular belief, both mainstream and whispered in shadows, is that the faces on these shoes were believed to protect the wearer from the evil eye, that pervasive curse of envy and malice in Roman culture. You recall how Romans carried amulets and charms, from tiny phallic pendants to carved gemstones, all to ward off misfortune. The shoe faces, staring solemnly from the toes, might have been an extension of this protective magic. Historians still argue whether this was symbolic or if the shoes were actually blessed by priests or augurs. Some records suggest special rituals were performed over the footwear before senators donned them for public appearances, invoking divine favor for their political battles. But the quirkier side is that some senators reportedly had multiple pairs of calcii with different faces for different occasions. A jovial, smiling pair for festivals, a fierce, lion-faced pair for moments of confrontation, and a somber, ancestral visage for funerals and times of reflection. This theatrical use of shoes as emotional armor is both fascinating and a little bit fun. Imagine the mental checklist before leaving the house. Do I feel like channeling my inner Caesar today, or going full Cato? You pause to consider how these shoes might have influenced the wearers themselves. Psychologists today know that clothing impacts mood and confidence. The Romans, consciously or not, might have understood this centuries ago, wrapping themselves in symbolic faces to summon the right mindset for whatever came next. Here's a more fringe theory. Some argue the faces were actually carved with hidden features, small scars or lines only visible under candlelight, that told secret stories known only to the senator's closest circle. These hidden details could serve as silent communications, coded warnings, or even calls for help in times of danger. No hard proof exists, but it's a tempting idea, like ancient spy gear sewn right into your shoes. In this quiet villa scene, the shoes become more than objects. They're companions and protectors, silent guardians of ambition and legacy. As the night deepens, the stars twinkle overhead, and you imagine those faces watching on, steady and unwavering, as the wheels of Roman power turn silently beneath the surface. The dawn creeps slowly over the city, casting a rosy glow on the colonnades and rooftops. You feel the pulse of Rome quicken as merchants set up stalls and citizens begin their daily rituals. But for the senators, the morning is a time of preparation and presentation, a final polishing of shoes and spirits before stepping back onto the public stage. You picture the bustling atrium of a senator's home, sunlight streaming through the open windows, illuminating a cluttered dressing area where slaves and attendants gather. The senator's shoes lie prominently displayed on a low bench, the faces on them carefully cleaned and buffed until they gleam like tiny sculptures. The face isn't just a decoration, it's a declaration, a badge that will speak before the senator even opens his mouth. One well-known historical fact is that the Roman Senate was highly theatrical, a place where image was everything. Senators practiced elaborate gestures and wore distinctive clothing, each element designed to reinforce status and authority. The calcii with faces were part of this visual rhetoric, a mobile mask for the feet, signaling power, wisdom, or lineage. Yet, historians still argue whether every senator actually wore these shoe faces regularly, or if they were reserved for ceremonial occasions only. Some sources suggest that the tradition faded over time, replaced by simpler footwear, while others insist the symbolism endured in less obvious ways. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some shoes apparently featured faces so detailed that they included miniature eyelashes, eyebrows, and even engraved wrinkles, features that required astonishing craftsmanship. These were luxury items, commissioned by the wealthiest senators, sometimes with precious metals inlaid for extra effect. It's almost like having tiny foot-sized portraits, and you can't help but imagine how that might feel, walking around with your face looking back at you. And then there's the open debate among scholars about the possible psychological effect these shoes had on both wearer and observer. Did seeing a stern, unyielding face on your own shoe bolster your confidence? Did opponents feel unsettled by the visual assertion of power underfoot? Or were these just pretty curiosities, more about fashion than function? We don't know for sure. Before leaving the atrium, you glimpse a pair of calcii with a mischievous smile carved into the toe. Perhaps a senator who didn't take himself too seriously. It's a reminder that even in the serious world of politics, there was room for personality and humor. You step outside, feeling the weight of tradition beneath your feet as you join the waking city. The faces on those shoes are more than symbols. They're the whispers of Rome's complex soul, marching endlessly forward. You wander back toward the Forum, the heart of the city now pulsing with voices, footsteps, and the clatter of daily life. The senators are gathering, their faces a mix of determination and fatigue after days steeped in political drama. But beneath their stately togas and behind their confident gazes, the shoes with faces remain a subtle yet potent presence, silent witnesses to history unfolding. You reflect on the long journey of these curious calcii. From humble leather in the cobbler's workshop to the halls of power, those faces have witnessed alliances forged, betrayals plotted, and speeches that shaped the empire. They've survived the slow decay of time and the changing tastes of centuries. Here's a mainstream historical fact to anchor your thoughts. The distinctive footwear of Roman senators was part of a strict dress code, codified in laws and customs, that reinforced social hierarchy and political order. Shoes weren't just footwear, they were a language. The faces on them added an extra layer of meaning, a personal signature worn on the body's lowest part, grounded yet commanding respect. But scholars still argue whether the facial designs were originally meant as purely decorative elements, or if they had deeper symbolic or even magical significance. Some believe they were protective talismans. Others see them as proud displays of lineage or power. The truth may lie somewhere in between, wrapped in the complexities of Roman culture. On a quirkier note, some legends claim that the faces on senators' shoes could speak, in a way, through subtle movements or changes in expression. Some sort of optical illusion created by light and shadow, or perhaps just clever craftsmanship that tricked the eye. Imagine the effect at a crowded Senate meeting, the faces seeming to judge or mock behind the scenes. It sounds like something out of a fantasy, but stories like these add a layer of enchantment to the story. As the day wears on, you realize those shoe faces are more than forgotten curiosities. They're symbols of identity, status, and the eternal human desire to be seen and known. They remind you that even in the vast machinery of empire, individual stories and personalities leave their mark in unexpected ways, even on a pair of shoes. And so, as you fade from this world of marble and leather, remember the faces that once watched from the feet of Rome's most powerful men, silent sentinels of ambition, tradition, and the endless march of history. Now that we've reached the end of our little journey through the marble corridors and dusty alleyways of ancient Rome, it's time to soften our stride, slow our breathing, and let the noise of the Forum melt into silence. You lie back now, maybe wrapped in a blanket, your room dim and quiet. The faces carved onto the shoes of long-gone senators blur gently in your mind. Stern brows, curved lips, little eyes fixed forward. The world they came from was brutal and brilliant, laced with ambition and ritual, but right now, it all feels far away, like a story whispered in the flickering candlelight. The streets of Rome grow quiet in your imagination. The markets shut their stalls. The torches dim. The calcii are slipped off and placed beside carved beds. And those little faces, once so stern and proud, finally get to rest too. Breathe in. Exhale. The sandals have stopped marching. The stone floors are cool and still. It doesn't really matter whether the shoes were magical or just stylish. What matters is that someone made them. Someone chose the face. Someone wore them. And somehow their story made it all the way to you. So tonight, let the weight of history press softly against your shoulders. Let it lull you, not with grandeur, but with the odd, gentle hum of human detail. The same strange mix of pride and vanity that puts a face on a shoe. Close your eyes. Let the arches fade. Let the crowd's whispers drift into the hush of dreams. Because in the end, even empires sleep.